Welcome to the Winged Hussar Pubcast. From fantasy to sci-fi to history and horror, your hosts are about to take you on a journey through all things Winged Hussar Publishing. Sit back and relax as we talk about writing, gaming, as well as interview some of your favorite authors. Let's wing it.
Hello and welcome back, everybody. I'm Brandon.
I'm Mark.
And today we're going to be talking about one of the most interesting things in a story, which is the dialogue, the way that characters talk to each other. Now, arguably, the narration is the most important thing because it tells you what's going on and sets the scene and tells you what the characters are doing. But I think dialogue is arguably more important. What do you think, Mark?
Dialogue's definitely really important for a whole lot of reasons we're going to go into. Is it more important? I'm not sure. I think the jury's out on that. I think it's one of the most important aspects of it, but I think it accompanies it. It drives the narrative, but for me, it's not more important.
That's fair. I think it's most important in characterization. I feel like that if you don't have enough dialogue or if you don't expand your dialogue enough, your characters are going to seem flat, two-dimensional, and you're not really going to get to know them. The audience won't get to know them. You might have a perfect idea in your head of how they act and talk, but if you don't explain that in dialogue, I feel like your audience is going to be just thinking they're two-dimensional sticks.
Having different dialogue between the different characters as well, I think is really important. It sounds really obvious, but there's some examples in really famous and successful settings where kind of all of the characters have got the same catchphrase and that sort of thing, and they all talk and act the same way, and it's a really good opportunity to make all the characters completely different, which is really important to do.
Yeah, I agree completely. So plot is the key thing in any novel. You know, the plot. What's the plot of the novel? How is the plot moving forward? And I think dialogue is a really great way that help advance the plot. It's kind of like a secret technique you can use to advance downtime or when people are traveling. You know, one of the issues that I have with my writing is, all right, I want to get to point A to point B, but I don't just want to teleport. My characters need to travel from point A to point B, but I don't want to make it boring. So what I like to do is, you know, you can pass some time in narration and saying, hey, they were on the road for blah, blah, blah. But I think it's really fun to use it as a segue. So you've now had them moving along and walking for a little while. Now they can start talking to each other, you know, and you can help pass the time on the road that way. You can have the characters interact. And it doesn't mean, sometimes the dialogue doesn't have to be, like, centric to the plot. You can just have them talking about, you know, a story. I remember my very first edits on Rebirth of Courage, the editor I was using, I had tried to explain the relationship between Darkflare and Attila, which are the two. Darkflare's my main character, Attila's the first character you meet. And I had said, you know, they're childhood friends, they've known each other forever. And the editor said to me, well, give us some example. Show us. You know, you can't just say they're friends. Like, explain some examples. And I had a flashback scene I put in to help show that. And I used dialogue to explain, you know, the relationship they had, how close they were. And, you know, they talked about the memory. So that's a good way of how dialogue can help explain. That's a good way to show how dialogue can help move the plot along and help further your characters. Is just even talking about a shared memory, just talking about a fact in the world that all the characters can relate to, that they can talk about.
Yeah, it ties in with the dreaded info dump thing, which crops up in sci-fi and fantasy a lot because it's an alien world, it's an unfamiliar world, and I find this is a really tricky. It's a fine line to tread between the two, because on the one hand you've got take sci-fi. We always fall back to Star Wars, don't we? Because everyone knows it. Try and explain a lightsaber to someone, and you're doing it, writing it down. You're doing it in the New Hope novel. Do you want to spend a page writing down, you know, kind of his you know, it has kyber crystals or whatever, it's superheated plasma, I don't know, all this stuff, or as you've got in the movie, just here it is, it's, you know, the elegant weapon of the Jedi from a different era. It's done in dialogue, and it's done quickly, it's done believably, it's done naturally and organically in the movie, the way it's written, and it's quick. What you don't want to have is say, okay, I've avoided the classic trap of an info dump in the narrative by having really unnatural dialogue and having someone just explain a weapon for 2 pages, because that doesn't really crop up. a good example of that would be in Aliens, where Hicks is explaining to Ripley about the pulse rifle because she's specifically asked and needs to be taught. That's where you learn about it. And that, again, it's convincing dialogue. It's good.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing that, if when writers do, they can nail it really well. But then when they have a hard time using it, it's I've read some novels where the characters just go from place to place and they don't interact unless they absolutely have to. So a lot of the time, like in a lot of stuff we do with the wargaming, I've read some of the books where the squad mates or the supporting characters will interact if they need direction. And it's just like, okay, well, but that's all we know of the character then, because there's no dialogue outside, there's no point of view outside, so we don't know anything more about this character because you're refusing to do dialogue between the main character. And I think that kind of segues into our next point pretty well, is that dialogue, I think the key thing about dialogue is that it helps you see through the lens of a different character who's not your point of view character. And one of the things that I learned in my writing that you helped me with a lot, Mark, and just from doing edits and everything, is you want to make sure you have a strong, consistent point of view. First-time authors, and again, I can speak from experience because I fell in this boat, but first-time authors tend to have such an idea of where they want the story to go that they just want to tell it, and they want an omnipotent narrator to be able to tell that story. And you lose a lot by doing it that way. You take people out of the scene. If an omnipotent narrator explains to you what everybody in the group is doing, it's almost like you're watching a bird's eye view of it, and then you can see what everyone's doing, but you lose that sense of how it relates to your character. You're kind of just reading a play-by-play instead of getting the emotions, the feelings of an individual character. And that's where point of view is so pertinent and so important, is that you have to remember you're in a character's point of view, exactly as it is. You want the readers to feel like they are reading and experiencing whatever you're writing about through that character's lens. That's what makes a good, strong character. And I feel like dialogue is a really good way to make sure that you are characterizing your supporting cast well, while still helping to further your main character's point of view characters' personalities. Because when he or she can talk to other people, you get to learn about how they feel about certain subjects. You get to learn more about your main character by the way they interact with others, and you get a sense of how other characters are based on how they react to that main point of view character. What do you think about that, Mark?
Totally agree with that. For people listening about what omnipotent narrative, it is what it, for anyone who doesn't know, it is exactly what it sounds like. So let's say you're writing a simple scene with 4 characters in. Something, I don't know, Agatha Christie-like, where someone in this room is the killer, that kind of deal. What you don't, the omnipotent narrative would then immediately let you know who the killer is, because they'll be there thinking, haha, it's me, I hope I don't get found out. And on page 3, you know who the killer is. So there is a time and place for omnipotent narrative, but if you go and read through any novels, the vast majority of novels do not employ omnipotent narrative as a technique. It is deliberately avoided. It's like a bad thing because it gives the reader far too much, and you're not working for it at that subconscious level to kind of... there's no reward for working out what's going on in the other characters' heads. Dialogue is where that's your fix for it. So that's when we don't know what's going on in character B, C, and D's head, but we get to find out about them. We judge them on their words and their actions. Same as you do in real life, really. So by what they say and how they say it, that's how you get to know the characters. It's also a really good tool. Scott Washburn in Broken Alliance, there's the one point of view, which is brave. Because if you don't gel with that character as a reader, that you got an issue. Most people go for an ensemble cast. I do every single time because I suppose I'm chickening out. Because by what they say and how they say it, you get to see what the world's point of view is on the character who you're seeing it through their eyes.
And I'll compound on that. I think it's really cool when you have multiple point of views. I like multiple point of views because I think you do it really well in Downfall, where that shines the best. And you have one of the characters doesn't have a point of view section until a certain point. And the way everybody perceives that character is, wow, she's a terrible person. You know, she's got this stick on her shoulder, and, you know, she's just chip on her shoulder. She's not a nice person. End of story. But then, and in the dialogue, it's even conveyed like, whoa, don't want to mess with this person. And I'm trying not to spoil as much as I can. I know Downfall's been out for a while, but just in case anybody's interested. But then you get to her point of view section, which you've purposely made it so that way she doesn't have any point of view sections until a certain part. And you start to learn that she talks like that for a reason. She has this front up for a reason. And I think that's where dialogue is so cool, because you perceive her in a certain way as the characters do, because you're looking through the eyes of a character. You're presented with the information that the character has. So the way she's talking to them is the way that they're perceiving her character. And that's what you're influenced by, is that dialogue and that point of view. But then you get to her point of view, and you see her way, her reasoning in her own mind for that dialogue. And it's just a cool shift to be able to see how dialogue can influence a character's viewpoint of another character.
Yeah, I mean, sticking with that example as well, whether I've done it well or not, I don't know. That's down to readers to judge. But with that particular character, there's 4 points of view characters in that story, and she deals with the other 3,
Yep.
and she is utterly, utterly horrible to 2 of them, and is very, very kind to one of them. And what drives that is the way that those 3 characters treat her on meeting her. She's instantly judgmental. So 2 characters are unkind, uncivil, aren't nice to her. So she is absolutely horrifically aggressive and never forgives. Whereas 1 is the perfect gentleman and opens with kindness. So she is so the dialogue is completely different in the scenes between them. That was at least what I was trying to, as I'll always say with all these things. It's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it, whether it's successful or not?
I think you do a great job with that. And, you know, not to make this a patting each other on the back session, but I have to say that you always, one of Mark's strengths, for those that haven't read his book, and for those who have, I think you can agree with me, is Mark's characterizations, and his characters are always the strongest part of his novels. And I think if you want to see some really good dialogue, 2 authors that I will highly recommend for really good dialogue is I highly recommend checking out any of Mark's books, because the dialogue between the characters is fantastic. And as well as check out John Leiby's upcoming Earhart, because he does some really good dialogue between the characters. And we're going to revisit John a little later in this episode, because there's some things I want to bring up about his dialogue. And it also comes down to, you know, that whole aspect of you want to make sure you're reading different authors and different genres and different point of views to be able to grab what works and what doesn't work. You know, as the editor, I'm able to see different authors and their different styles. And I've kind of leaned on Mark's examples when I'm giving authors feedback sometimes. I'll say, you know, this is cool, but I think if you did this in dialogue, it would be better. And I mean, even to an extent, I give that feedback for a lot of things generally. Like, an author will sometimes say, like, oh, they did this, like, random thing. They went over there and set it up, or they asked this question. And I'm like, okay, but you're telling the audience what they're doing. I think it would be better in dialogue, because you get a little bit more characterization. Sometimes I think authors will lean on the fact of, I want to get this little bit done quickly, so I'm going to put it in narration. And sometimes it works. But sometimes I feel like it would be better in dialogue. It would be better if you told us, you showed us what was going on instead of telling us. That's one thing to say, like, oh, he asked them a question. All right, fine, whatever. But it's another thing to say, you know, he asked them which way to go, and he told them to go that way. Well, you know, for example, if you want to add a little humor, that's where, in a throwaway character like that, like a guard or a grunt or something, you can add in a little bit of humor if that's what you're going for. I'll give a personal example. In Rebirth of Courage, the first part of the novel, our main character enters a tournament. And he's been to this town numerous times over the years. It's like a second home, and he knows the tournament guard well. And I kind of took that opportunity, you know, even in the minor characters, it's a chance to flesh out a world. And in a world that's my own, I wanted to flesh out some of the more humorous aspects. So I made the guy, like, a little bit more rotund and sweating and glasses, and he didn't recognize him at first, and then he's just like, come on, I'm the only person that comes here with a wyvern on my shoulder. He's like, oh yeah, it's you, I know you. So it's that chance of dialogue that then allows you to set the tone to be a little more humorous, and allows you to throw in a little detail of, look, this character has a wyvern as a pet, and it's a rarity because not a lot of people come through with one. So dialogue can even be used in the most minor moments with the most minor characters to help flesh out your whole entire world.
I'm just blown away because I think this is a real watershed moment for me. That's how wyvern's pronounced in America.
Wyvern, wyvern.
I didn't know that.
It's tomato, tomato.
No, yeah, but which again is dialogue. That's amazing.
Yes.
It's a shame. It's a shame. I find that it's hard to put stuff across phonetically sometimes when you're writing dialogue and the narrative for that matter. But certainly the characterization that you mentioned, and I don't know if this is going a rung too deep, but having that characterization through the dialogue, through the way that people talk, I think is really important. Now, have you heard of the Myers-Briggs type indicator, or am I going too deep into something off script here?
I have, but it's been a long time since I've refreshed myself, so why don't you refresh me and the audience with that?
So Carl Jung was an eminent psychologist at the turn of the 20th century, and he did groundbreaking work into personal rather than group psychology. And Myers-Briggs, which was a mother-daughter management team, I suppose, for want of a better term, took his work and expanded on it to come out with a Myers-Briggs type indicator, which says that every human being ultimately falls into one of 16 character types, which is a 4x4 grid. That's why it's 16. Now, detractors of it, people who don't like it, say, well, it's just like horoscopes, in that you can twist any of those to fit any person at any time. All of that's fine, but a lot of people like horoscopes, so I guess we could use either of those. If you're writing a whole load of characters and you're struggling to make them different, one thing that you could do is, if you like horoscopes, assign each of them a star sign. If you think the Myers-Briggs type indicator has got something to it, assign each of them a type indicator. And then when you come to writing them, you've then got a way to move forward. And one of the things with Myers-Briggs, that one of the simplest starts to it is a person an introvert or an extrovert? Now, that's the psychological definition, not the layman's definition, so it's subtly different, but it doesn't matter. In terms of the dialogue, if you assign introvert or extrovert to each of your characters straight away, you'll bring them to life in the scenes through the dialogue, because the extroverts will naturally talk more than the introverts. And then you've got a bit of that consistency, just a simple way to do it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think that you hit on this a little bit with this, and you hit a little bit on it earlier, but I think creating dialogue for each individual character is very important in characterizing them. I think something as simple that I've picked up on is contractions. Whether your character uses contractions or not, that you have to kind of, when you're writing good characters, you want to make sure you're vocalizing it in your head. So if you have a character that talks a certain way, you want to be able to hear that every single time. One of the things I like to do actually is when I'm making characters for the first time, I like to envision how they look and how they sound. So I will, a lot of times I go on Hero Forge and I create a miniature of them. And also I kind of just look at actors and I think, who would be a good actor to play this person? And I kind of have that in my head. Or if it's animated, I think, well, how would they look animated? And the next thing I do is, what voice actor do I think would best portray them? Or what actor would best vocalize them? Or what do I think their voice sounds like? Then from there, every time that they're talking or I'm writing dialogue, I hear it in my head. So certain characters, I know, don't use contractions. So when I'm going through and rereading what I've written, I have to make sure I'm not using contractions because that's the way they talk. And I think that helps really add strength to their character, who they are. Certain characters will only use certain words. Certain characters will not use certain words. I think that also ties back into if they're an introvert or extrovert, like you're saying, how does their personality affect their dialogue? That's a big thing. And I think that some new writers especially, I think that they look at dialogue and they say, they look at it as a means to an end. They're telling a story, and yeah, the characters have to interact, but they don't really put too much thought behind it. But I think what separates a good writer from an average writer is the thought that goes into writing the dialogue, because it's another extension of your story. And if you're looking at the characters as saying, I'll take this as another standpoint. As an editor, if I'm looking at, let's say, Downfall, I can read Kyle Hawkins in the voice I've created in my head, and it's consistent through the dialogue. I can read Jim Cochran, and I can hear his voice consistent in the dialogue. I can listen to Lisette Beckman and hear her voice consistent in the dialogue. And as an editor, if there's ever a point where I'm just like, that doesn't sound right, I think you've seen it in practice, Mark. I've actually said, like, I don't necessarily think this is in dialogue. I don't think this is in character for them to say. I feel like they would use this instead. I feel like this is too refined, I would go with this instead, or this is too colloquial or casual, I would go with this instead. I think that's a big part of, you want to make sure your dialogue is consistent as well as your characters are. That's
one of the key things with having the editor come back and have a look through stuff. And I know I'm doing a little bit more editing these days rather than the writing, which is a completely different skill set. It's completely new to me, and it's interesting.
It's a challenge, isn't it?
To have someone be able to analyse that. Oh, hugely. We can do that. I'll have a chat about that on another session, I think. But in terms of when I look back and look at the novels that you've edited for me, that is one of the things which crops up, and that is really important. And it is funny, without going into the negatives, I always do this dive into the negatives, that you do get some authors who will come back and go, no, I disagree with every single point you've made. And which is frustrating when you're trying to do the editing. And it's like, okay, well, you do you, I guess. But that was certainly one of the things which was most useful to me in the novels I've done, is when you've come back and said there is inconsistency in the dialogue. The contractions is an interesting one as well. It's when I was first starting writing in the fantasy genre, it was like a really easy cheat mode which didn't work well for elves. Elves talk good, don't they? So let's make elves never use contractions. They're really simple, and give other fantasy races strong regional accents. And there's a lot of cliches like that, which I'm not recommending or advocating at all.
That's an episode I want to talk about soon. Is regional dialects. That was our other pitch for today that I brought up. But anyway, go on.
It's the importance of in the editing process of having the extra set of eyes look through all of your stuff. And the thing is, though, that's not just specific to dialogue. I don't think dialogue is a minefield, because as soon as you start writing about different characters, that they should be talking differently. They should have different experiences and different upbringings, different levels of education, common sense, whatever it is. So they should all speak differently. And it's but you're one author, so when you're writing it, there will naturally be a part of you coming through all of those characters. So that's why it's really important to have the editor pick it up and just go, this character, you're 150 pages in, right, and they've stopped talking like themselves. They've started talking like you.
And just to kind of tie back into things, because what we're doing on this show is, we're not just talking about Winged Hustler, but we're also trying to give tips to new authors people who are just interested in writing. I think some of the key takeaways you can take from what we've been talking about so far is you want to make sure when you're crafting dialogue, you want to try to make it as important as your character as far as like what makes them unique and different and what things they do and don't do. And I think it's just important to keep dialogue in mind when you're creating your characters. If there's one thing to take away from what we've said so far, it's just keep dialogue in mind and try to make sure that your characters are unique in that aspect as well.
Yeah, in terms of tips for new writers, which I always feel a little bit on shaky foundations giving, but one from another company which I read, which I think is really good, and you've already said it anyway, but just to sort of almost formalise it, and one from me. This is going back a couple of decades, but Black Library, when they were first starting up and they were still kind of open to unsolicited manuscripts from new authors, they had something on their webpage to say, here's some basics which you have to follow if you want us to consider you. And one of them was about dialogue, which was a simple rule which said, write dialogue, don't describe it. And the example they gave was a Thunderhawk gunship taking a load of troops into a fight, and they have like a bad example then a good example. And the bad example was the pilot of the gunship told the troops in the back they were approaching the drop zone. Whereas the good example is put it in dialogue to say specifically what the pilot is saying, the stress in their voice, the reaction from the guys in the back. And that's the key difference is if you can write the actual dialogue, there's very, very, very few occasions where it's going to work better to say someone talked about this without actually saying what it was. Well, that was Black Library's one, and I think it's fantastic. It sounds so obvious when you say it out loud, but I hadn't been doing it till I read that, and I think it's really good. The second one, something from me, and again, this is just my slant on it, it's not a rule or anything, is when you write long segments of dialogue, read it out loud and see how natural it sounds. Because it's really easy to write something which seems really good on paper, and then you can read it out and just think, people don't talk like that. That sounds really weird. It sounds really clunky. It's not naturally flowing. And particularly for sci-fi and fantasy in combat scenes. Now, if you've never done martial arts, fencing, whatever it is, even if you just watch fight scenes in movies which are well crafted, if you have 2 paragraphs of dialogue during a sword fight, it just doesn't work. People are concentrating on not being killed by their adversary. You might have time to shout out the odd word, the odd curse, whatever it might be, but to explain entire things and to then call them a vile cur and all this stuff, for me, it doesn't sit well. Whereas it can be done for comedic effect. Princess Bride, the sword fights in that are absolutely fantastic, and there's quite a lot of dialogue in it because it works so well, but it's funny. That's the point. It's not supposed to be believable. It's supposed to make you laugh. Whereas if you look at, again, I love Star Wars, but the lightsaber fight at the end of Episode 3, I don't think it was George Lucas's best dialogue writing. Was that, well, from my point of view, the Jedi, that's not the sort of thing you'd say if you're fighting for your life, I don't think. But that's
you helped me a lot with that because, in Rebirth of Courage, I have 6 characters as part of the main cast. And so one of the issues that I had was making sure that the reader knew who was talking to who. So I would use first names a lot. So, like, who they were addressing. So if Darkler was talking to Attila, he'd be like, blah, 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 Attila. And you said, that's not really how real people talk. And in my head, I was like, it makes sense. But then when you said it, I'm just like, but from a reading standpoint, I can get rid of it. And I can rework the narrative slightly to show the cues of who he's talking to instead of doing that. And, you were right. It was a big help. And that's another point of the editor even needs an editor, as I've talked about before. But that was a big help to me, is to even just rework slight bits of that. So that way the name was taken out of the dialogue and reworked into stage cue, more or less. And then you have a stronger dialogue and you know who's talking to who without having to say the person's name 7,000 times. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as well.
When people are talking to people, as a general rule of thumb, it's more common than not to maintain eye contact, so you look at the person you're addressing. So for me, if there's a lot of people in a group conversation, I would write in the narrative to say that the harder part is to try and get to get differences instead of just saying person A turned to person B and just using that phrase all the time, but have them look at the person they're addressing and then deliver the line. So if we were face to face rather than over the internet now, I would turn to Brandon to look at you and say it. I wouldn't just keep saying Brandon, then tell you something. It's people don't use names in face to face conversation that much. So yeah, it's again reading it out loud and saying, is this really how people talk?
So today's episode is sponsored by On Military Matters, your source for new, used, and out-of-print books on military history, wargaming, and modeling. Check them out at onmilitarymatters.com and make sure to sign up for the weekly e-flyer. So narration in dialogue, interwoven, I think you kind of that's kind of the point where you were getting at, that I think is a really important thing too, is if stage cue, kind of like I said, you don't want to have everybody go, he said, she said, But you can then work, like when I work with a group of characters, one of the things I like to do is, like, if I'm having somebody talk and then somebody different answer or third person answer, what I like to do is have that person say something slight, so that way they're beginning dialogue. And then I do something like, this character put his hands on his hips, or something like that. I think if you have dialogue mixed with body language, that's a really strong way to convey the characters as well. Body language works really well in dialogue, and I think that's another thing that people feel like they need to attach a said with every time. And that's one of the things I struggle with some authors, is the repetition of he said, she said, they said and did this. It's like sometimes you can just have the dialogue, have an action, and then continue the dialogue. That slight little input of narration in there, I think, helps to keep it so that way you know who you're talking to, and then you're not have to repeating a name, but you're still giving characterization and personality cues.
Yeah, I think looking at the edits I've had from you, it's a slightly different error I keep committing, which is instead of saying he said, she said, I'll try and come up with a more impressive, ostentatious word. So it'll be, he retorted or something like that. It still ends up being exactly the same problem, really, in that it can slow dialogue down. Particularly if you want quick fire dialogue, if you're having an argument, a heated argument between two characters, you can just just start the flow. Just have what the first character says, then put the dialogue of the second, then the first, then the second, then the first, and it keeps things moving really fast. You want to break it up occasionally so you can remind the reader who it is who's saying which alternate line of dialogue. But you certainly don't need to put he and she said after everything. It can really clog things up.
That's another really good point, is when you have two characters and you're writing good dialogue, and it's, of course, all of this good that I keep saying, it's subjective. But I think the best dialogue, when somebody has written really, really good dialogue, it can stand on its own without needing narration constantly. Like you said, it's very helpful to remind the readers who's speaking. Sometimes when I'm doing edits, I have to actually go back up and count the lines. If it's too spaced out or the characters are too similar in talking, I'll be like, wait, hold on. Which one? This doesn't make sense. Who said this? Are they sure it's not this person who said this? So sometimes I'll add in notes for the author saying, a cue would be good here about who's talking, because I've lost track or I don't understand. This doesn't seem like what they would be saying. So just you cue in who this actually is. But good writing of dialogue can stand on its own, a few lines at least, and just that natural flow, like you were saying, and it's done well. I think this all comes down to like experimentation. I think that if you're an aspiring writer, you should try a couple different ways, a couple different styles to see what works best for you, and sometimes take a chance. If you're listening to this and you go, oh, I put narration after every single quote, take a chance. Try not on some of them if it's between two characters, and just see if that works for your style of writing.
Conversely, I think as well, another problem which can crop up is, what if you have, let's say, a character is telling a story to a whole load of other people. So if they're left alone, that character is going to have 3 pages of dialogue, and how do you break that up? And it doesn't even need to be that long. You could end up with, say, 2 to 3 paragraphs with half a page. You still want to break it up a little bit. So it's about taking a pause. And you mentioned body language before, so non-verbal communication. So you can just stop, put something, I don't know, if it's a campfire story scene, something like that, just a noise in the environment which distracts people's attention for a second. It can add a bit of atmosphere doing it that way, and then back into the same character doing the dialogue again.
Yeah, I think that's become one of my new personal pet peeves, and it's basically because I did that in the beginning. When I was writing Rebirth of Courage, there was a scene where, I think you know this, there's a character. There was a lot of info dump I wanted to do, but I didn't want to do it in narration, so I did it in dialogue. But in the end, it was still a giant info dump. So I had to rework that whole part to have more interspersed narration and more interaction between 2 of the characters instead of just one character. But I did long sections of just dialogue without any interruption, and it's now become my personal pet peeve, I think, when I see a character talking and then the paragraph ends and I don't see the end quote and they go on to another dialogue, a lot of times it's fine. But in my head, I just get really annoyed. I'm like, we could do this better. We could do it stronger. We don't have to have 2 paragraphs of dialogue. And some authors will do interesting, where they will finish the paragraph and then they'll start a new paragraph with the same dialogue, but they'll only make it a single line. And that single line is the emphasis, and that's why they made it in a paragraph. So it's interesting little techniques you can do. But yeah, when you do too much dialogue, then it becomes an info dump, just as the same as it would be in narration. So you have to have an even mix.
Yeah, it's that too much dialogue can be done deliberately. You can be trying to show, for example, again, show don't tell, show that someone is really, really nervous in a situation, so they talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And if you've crafted that well, it's a far more effective way. Instead of saying, oh, character B was clearly nervous, well, don't say it, show it. And one of the things that a lot of people do when they are nervous is talk way more than they normally would. So it can be done for that. But if that's not what you're trying to do, then it's certainly worth breaking it up.
Yeah, I think that's a fun little exercise we can do to help kind of show people is the techniques we use to show things. So like dashes and ellipses, stuttering. You got to think about when people stutter. One of the techniques I like to emphasize this with writers, and not a lot of them take advantage of it. When you have a character who's nervous, they're going to stutter. So if they're saying, like, what's the problem? You could do, what's the problem? Like with W-W to show them stuttering. You don't want to do it to comedic effect if the tone is serious, but you can do that to show there's hesitation. Ellipses, if somebody, if they're thinking, kind of like I'm doing, where they're thinking about what they're trying to say, you can use ellipses to be like, what is ... going on in there? Those are techniques you can use in dialogue to show emotion and emphasis.
I think to get the best effect out of it, if you were going to have someone stutter or stammer to show that they're nervous, then just do that and leave it. Just that's how you've made your point subtly. Don't have the dialogue and then say whoever stammered. Well, we know who stammered. You've just written it, and certainly don't put whoever stammered nervously. It's like, well, you're trying to convey the nervous subtly, so don't hit the reader over the head and say, yeah, they're nervous, just in case you didn't get it. Because again, it's all about that subconscious, the reader feeling that they are working it out for themselves rather than being spoon-fed makes it a more enjoyable story.
I read Stephen King's On Writing, and I didn't agree with a lot of it. I think as I get older, I might agree with some more of it, but I read it in high school, and I was just like, I don't agree with a lot of this. I understand. I'm just not a huge Stephen King fan. I haven't really read much of his work, but I'm not a huge fan of his. But everybody was like, if you're going to be a writer, read On Writing. And I think I got like 3 copies of On Writing over the years. And I'm like, okay, I get it. Yeah, read On Writing. And I read it, and I didn't read it to completion, but there was one piece he said that always resonates with me. If I took anything away from that book, it's don't ever use adverbs. If you are using a word that ends in ly, find a way to describe it instead. Don't ever use an adverb in writing, because an adverb is immediately going to be telling instead of showing. If you are going to try to convey something like nervously, then use the dialogue to convey that nervousness. Don't say he did it nervously, like you were saying. Use context to show the audience that. I think that's one of the biggest things that I've been very, very strict with my editing, is if I see an adverb, I try to get rid of it.
Oh gosh, I'm just thinking now of all the stuff I've written. I think I'm a serial offender of that.
Well, it's the type of thing where if you don't know, like, you're just going to write it because a word is a word, and there's never been a code of ethics in the writing word to say, you cannot use these words, or you should not do this. It's just something you pick up over the years. That's just one of the things I've added to my editing style over the years, is that's just something I look for. And maybe you and I have done it, I've written it out to you subconsciously without really telling you why I was doing it that way. But that's just a thing to keep in mind, is, moving forward, Mark, keep this in mind. All you listening, keep this in mind. If you're using an adverb, think twice about it.
Yeah, that's a good shout. I mean, I'm going off-piste a little bit here, but when I was doing creative writing in the early days and having lessons on it, one thing the teacher said about, rules, certain words you can't use, said unless it's in dialogue, because people do use this word, if you're writing in the narrative, never ever use the word got, because there is always a better way to describe something. You wouldn't say, he went and got in the car. You would say he went and lowered himself into the car, or something to lowered himself slowly to insinuate that it's difficult for that character to get into that seating position, whatever it might be. But people use got in dialogue all the time, and that's absolutely fine. But in the narrative, it's a word ever since this was pointed out to me, it leaps out to me now. But, it's not a rule. It's just, I think it works though.
You bring an interesting point up, is one of the issues that I have with authors that I get the most pushback on is certain author. I try to adhere to quote unquote perfect English. So words that are not used, kind of like got. That's the best example. You kind of hit it in the head. If somebody does that in dialogue, but like, let's say, so have and has, so like plural and singular, I'm very anal about making sure that everything lines up properly. But but dialogue is always where I find it hard, because I got a lot of pushback in the early days of people saying, well, that might be the correct way to use that pluralization or stylization, but I want him to speak like this. And it's like, okay, fine, that's author choice, that's dialogue, I can chalk it up to that. But then I've had readers come to me and say, oh, this wasn't edited because, this isn't correct. And I've had to say, well, I know. It's dialogue. It's a fine line between what is right and what is author interpretation, because technically they're right, it's not correct, and it bothers me a little bit because I want it to be correct, because that's part of my job, because I know somebody is going to do exactly that and say this isn't correctly written. But at the same point, I do have to relent to the author and say, if this is how you want them to speak, then that's for the audience to take away of maybe this person isn't the most intellectual character because he's speaking like this, or maybe the character just doesn't know any better. I think that's an interesting line to try to draw in dialogue, of what is okay to mispronounce or misword, and what does the editor have to then keep an eye out for that has to be changed.
It's a really good tool to show someone's background, someone's education. I grew up in the north of England, and double negatives were really common in certain areas. So instead of saying, for example, no, I didn't, someone might say, no, I never, which grammatically doesn't make any sense, but it's really common in the area I grew up in. But if you put that in dialogue, then you'll have some people. Yeah, people will put in the dreaded comment section. We'll put, that's wrong. It's like, no, it is wrong, but it's deliberately wrong because it's in dialogue, and it's a tool that you can use to show more about the character and their background.
But in speaking of characterization and dialogue and dialect, I think one of the points that you and I have discrepancy with is cursing. And I have 2 point of views with it. I have a personal point of view and I have a business point of view. And the personal point of view is I curse like a sailor. I can curtail how much I curse on a platform like this, or when I'm at work, or when I'm around my kids. Honestly, when I had kids, my biggest concern was going to be, how am I going to stop cursing? I curse so much. I'm never going to be able to stop cursing. And my wife was really harping on me, don't curse. Lo and behold, she's the one that curses not all the time. She's the one that lets one slip around the kids, and I'm the one that just like, you said a bad word. But in private company, or, on a headset playing a game, I curse like a sailor because it's just part of my language. But on a professional standpoint, when I'm editing these novels, we've kind of taken up the viewpoint of, we don't want cursing to be prevalent throughout our novel. And it's for a couple of reasons. And, this is something that, you and I have talked about, Mark, and we can have a whole episode on, but I think it's good to bring it up here about, in a wargaming novel, you can have blood and guts and murder, but you can't have naughty words. And I think, as I've interpreted it to you before, is I think that a young, impressionable mind, if you don't spell out, he pulled out his entrails and strangled him with it and, gouged out his eyes repeatedly. If you're not going into that much detail, but you said he shot him down with an arrow, or he sliced him down in half. A young, impressionable mind can kind of interpret that to be however they want it to be. You know, they might see, this is going to sound silly, but they might see Orion slash down an infernal, an abyssal, and confetti pops out of them. You know, they might not know that, oh, there goes all the blood and guts spilling out. But if you say FSDC, etc., they're going to go, what does that word mean? And then they can start repeating that word. And that's how we've always looked at it, and that's what Vince kind of took away from Black Library is, you know, you want to make sure you're not going to say words that you want anybody to read a book. I mean, that's the industry we're in. We want everybody to pick up a book and read. My kids, I push 3 books on my kids a night. Not push, but I encourage my son to read 3 books a night, and he willingly sits down. That's part of his night routine, and he picks out 3 books and we read a night. I want to foster that as he grows older, and I think as we develop more towards a screen generation, we lose that, and I'm just as culpable. But you want to try to foster more people to read. And if Vince's mindset has always been, if you set the language to be a certain level, you are then cutting out a certain audience. And while they're, like, again, the other stuff they can interpret how they want, but the curse words are called curse words for a reason because, you know, repeated, you don't want certain age range to repeat that. So I always like using made up words, or sometimes, like a lot of times, you don't even have to curse and it can sound just as well. And the argument about that is, well, it doesn't sound realistic. And I get that, I really do. But in a fantasy setting, you don't necessarily need it to sound realistic. In science fiction, yes, I understand that it's based in reality, you know, most times, and you want to have cursing because it feels more realistic. But when you're talking about a fantasy work, you don't necessarily need them to be saying DSFC, all the curses, because they don't necessarily. Who's to say those words actually exist there? You know, and then you can get into the whole background about damnation and, you know, tying damnation to faith, and, you know, if there's no Christian faith in the world you're working, is damnation still exist? And then you can get into a whole theological and debate on that and whether that word actually exists. So it's interesting. You can kind of just take a stance, I think, of saying these words just don't exist, and you can still tell the sentence you want to tell and the narration you want to tell and the dialogue you want to tell without using them, and it can still come across strong. Flip side of things, with science fiction, I read Gaunt's Ghosts when I was young, and as somebody who read it when I was young, I wasn't fazed by the blood and guts and gore. Again, my mind at a young age didn't necessarily interpret all that. But when he said the word Feth to be kind of like an iteration combination of S, and it has no actual connotation in the real world, as a kid, I just said Feth to everything. And my parents didn't get upset because it wasn't a real word. It was just me saying nonsense. And to me, it was nonsense, but it was a quote-unquote curse word I could say without getting in trouble because it had no connotation to anything else. So that's why I like when you make up your own curses. It's hokey, and I know you've got some stuff to say about that, Mark, but I feel like you gotta draw a line somewhere, and that's where I draw the line professionally. Again, personally, I don't care. I could give 2 S's. I think we're trying to go for a family vibe on this podcast, so that's why I'm trying not to swear. But I personally don't care about swearing on a personal level.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't really stopped to think about the difference between how you look at sci-fi and fantasy. And yeah, that is an interesting way of looking at it. I'd agree with that. For me, right, would these words exist? Well, if you say looking at a fantasy setting, we do stuff for Kings of War for Mantic, and I know Mantic's stance is that they're not too keen on too much swearing because they want to open the marketability of a novel to a younger audience, and that makes 100% sense. I'm totally on board with that. So the way I would write dialogue in a Kings of War story is completely different to how I would do dialogue in an Infinity story. But I still think those words would exist, because to say, okay, these words don't exist, well, the entire English language we're writing in doesn't exist because it never, in the world of Panathor where we're writing, there is no England. Oh, what a terrible thought! But there's no English language, Therefore, none of these words exist, but would the equivalent, what we're writing when we write the narrative, when we write the dialogue, is the equivalent in that language. And if we look across all of the cultures in the real world, swearing in all of the cultures, it follows certain trends. Sexual swear words are very prevalent, and again, because of what they're referencing, that's why it's unsuitable for younger people. But I think those words would exist. Now, does that mean they have to be in a fantasy setting? No, not at all. I don't think it's true that, well, a lot of fantasy settings are based traditionally. It's changing a lot now that the genre is opening up, but traditionally a lot of them were based on medieval Western and Central Europe. And so, well, does that mean in those days, in the medieval days, people didn't swear as much? Probably, I doubt that. I think they probably did swear just as much. I don't know. So for me, well, we get the made up swear words now. For anyone of my age who's on this side of the pond, they'll know about a TV series called Red Dwarf, which had its famous made up swear word, which for comedic effect worked really well, and it wasn't very offensive, and that's great. But for me, and not having a go at anyone who does try that, you lose the immersion, because it feels a bit trite to me. I'm not a professional author. It's something I do on the side. It's a creative outlet. But in my day job, I have been involved in high pressure situations, not office work, as in I have a job which has life or death situations where I've been dealt with dead bodies, where I've had to make decisions which will make an impact to life and death there and then, and you do swear. It is natural. So in these things, when you're writing about wargaming and you're writing about conflict and you're writing about high pressure situations, rather than having facing off against an adversary and saying, I will now strike you down like you deserved, you vile cur, for doing it. That's not how people talk. People will just let out a swear word. That's more natural dialogue to me. So having that it's grounded in reality. It's people. It's how people talk. So if the franchise allows it and is marketed at an adult audience, as Corvus Belli do, that's what I'll go for. That doesn't mean it's right. It's just that's what I'll go for, because for me it's more grounded in reality. But if you want something like what Mantic are going for, whereas we want a younger audience, then yeah, shy away from it. That's fine. I'm absolutely cool with that. But I still have a smattering of swearing. But for me, well, where do you cut off? What is an acceptable swear word for a younger audience? And you only need to look at the single greatest movie in the history of entertainment, Back to the Future, and look at what swearing was acceptable in Back to the Future. And that's there's a few swear words, there's a smattering of them in that movie, which is PG under UK classification, parental guidance. You can take a 3-year-old to watch it. So if the parent deems it's okay. And there's some pretty dark stuff in that movie when you watch it with adult eyes. Jeez. That's my benchmark for Kings of War. Back to the Future levels of swearing, which there's a smattering of in the Kings of War ones I've done.
It's definitely an interesting topic, and I have this conversation with nearly every author. And most people are, they're like, fine, whatever, okay, it is what it is. But and it's hard to judge, it really is. I mean, with Downfall, we cut out a significant amount of curses, but we still got some feedback that said, oh, the swearing was too excessive and too distracting. It's like, okay, have you read the Infinity source material? There's a significant amount more cursing and swearing than our books. And even at that, it's like you almost want to give them the first draft and be like, here, you read this and you tell me which one you prefer. Like, how much, again, it's the question of where do you draw the line with people? Some people will say, I want none, and that's why we take that professional standpoint. Other people say, I need more swearing. I don't understand the need. I understand I'm fine with it, but I don't need to be swearing. I've done some freelance work about, military novels, and just some of the graphic swearing in some of those, I don't mind it, but it's just, it's weird. I have a hard, it's not that I'm disgusted by it, but I'm just like, okay, what's the point of it? I feel like with anything, there should be a point to it. With any, and we talked about this with character deaths, that there needs to be a point to it. And I think swearing should be the same thing. I think if you're going to swear, there should be a point to it. I think you should swear to show emphasis or to show frustration. But I think it's silly to swear for the sake of swearing or that you want to seem cool. Just like you're choosing a word for a reason. You're choosing running instead of walking. You're choosing treading carefully instead of meandering. There's a reason why you're choosing words. So I think that there needs to be a conscious choice behind choosing a swear word. And a lot of the authors, depending on the material, if they feel strongly about it, like they need to have it because it's, for whatever reason, if they need it, because they need it, it's the only word that will show the emphasis that they need, I usually would say fine. Because again, personally, I don't care. But it's a tough water to tread, and I think it's something that people take for granted in dialogue because you're either on one side, usually. You're either of the kind of like me where you don't care, and it's whatever, it's words, it doesn't bother you, or you're on the side that's so offended that you can't even breathe or think because somebody said a not nice word. It's tough. We try to make it a standpoint of these are how our books are going to be. We want to set a standard for anybody can pick up a book, but with certain settings, it just is provoking for it. So it's something for authors to keep in mind is the setting and how your dialogue is going to affect the setting.
Yeah, you're right. I think it doesn't need too much. I was laughing when he said about the first draft of Downfall for... yeah, sorry about that. I think we cut out 75% of the swearing for the one which went to print, which shows how bad the first one was. But I had a laugh writing it, and it is all about me, so that's good. A genre where it stands out, one which leaps to mind of like when can it be really effective? When can it really work? So Second World War aviation stuff. There's a famous movie from the 1960s called Battle of Britain, which pretty much defines how the UK thinks military pilots talk, which is just sort of sauntering around and calling everyone old chap and always being very, very prim, proper and British. There was a much lower budget movie called First Light, was it? Anyhow, it's about the youngest Spitfire pilot at the start of the war, and it's based on his autobiography. So none of it's fiction. It's all as it was. And I believe because the gent in question he lived to a ripe old age. I think he was a technical advisor on the movie. And there's a bit where you've got this 19-year-old in a Spitfire over the English Channel who's got separated and is lost, and he's just sat there looking at his map and looking at the sea and seeing no landmarks, just saying the F word again and again and again. And that's but that was 1940. No one swore back then. They did. I'm sure they did. And the very man was there to be a technical advisor on this movie. And that for me was a really simple but effective way of showing the despair and the stress and the anguish and the panic in just a single word, because that is how people act. That is how they talk.
It's definitely different. We've covered a lot of different topics on dialogue. I'm trying to go over what other things I want to talk about, but can you have a novel without dialogue? Can you have a novel where you just have narration from a single character who's like almost like, how do you write a character who's the last standing person? I think it's even a short story. I don't think it's a good written technique. I think you should even try to find ways to have dialogue, even if you're having the main character talk to him or herself, or talk to ghosts. I think you need dialogue. I don't think you can have a really good story without it.
Having a really good story with just one character. Oh gosh, none leap to mind. It sounds quite pretentious and art house, something to try. I can't think of anything which is just about, well, actually, what's that Tom Hanks movie where he's, is it Castaway? I still haven't seen it, but I've heard it's absolutely amazing. I've heard it's really good. So yeah, I guess in that context, I'm sure at the start and the end, before he gets cast away and when he gets found again, there's lots of dialogue, but for the majority of it, it's going to be very limited. So
he's got Wilson. He's got the volleyball.
I've heard about Wilson's fate, and that's why I don't think I can face that movie. Yeah, I don't know.
But he talks to Wilson.
Okay, that's completely disproved my theory. Yeah, I don't know.
There was a book I read when I was in grade school. I'm just trying to remember if there was any dialogue in it. Did you ever read the book Hatchet?
No, never read that.
So it's about a guy who crashes, and they made a few sequels to it, I'm pretty sure. And he kind of survives in the wilderness. And I think this is where my enjoyment of fort-based games, or you're surviving, you got to build an encampment. Why I like to play Fort with my son. It is this guy basically survives on an island until help arrives. But all he has is a hatchet. I'm pretty sure that's it. Is when the plane crashes, he has a hatchet, and the pilot dies. And I'm pretty sure he talks to the pilot's dead body.
Wow, that's grim.
I think there's dialogue in the beginning, but I think he makes up dialogue either in his head, talking to the dead body. There's dialogue in it. I just don't remember the detail of it. But that's what sprang to mind when I said a book with no dialogue. And I'm thinking of have you seen the movie A Quiet Place?
No. I've seen all of the Back to the Future trilogy. I don't think I need to see much else, but no, I haven't seen that.
I haven't seen it either, but I have to question the level of dialogue in that because the whole movie's about being quiet. So it's interesting I think it's different in a movie because you can see what's going on. You have your visual cues. But in writing, I think you need dialogue to tell a good story. I don't think it's possible to write a really award-winning, phenomenal story without dialogue. That's my personal take on it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And I think even at that length, I think you need to have dialogue pretty frequently. That's why I say dialogue, I think, is one of the most important things, because if you go pages of narration without dialogue, it's obvious. You really border going into the show don't tell at that point, because what are you doing if somebody's not talking? What's going on? If there's a battle scene or a fight scene of some sort, that's one thing, because there is no dialogue. If there's action, that's one thing. But how are you advancing the story? What are you doing if there's no dialogue? That's the question I think up-and-coming author, any author, should really question, is what is going on in the absence of dialogue? Narration is, like I said, they go hand in hand. It's just as important. But you have to be careful that you're not info-dumping or you're not telling too much without showing. If you're going pages or paragraphs without any dialogue, I think that's a real concern.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just, I think we've gone full circle, haven't we? In terms of what we said in the opening segment of this one is it the most important thing? Is it more important than the plot? For me, it's on a par. It's just as important. If you're just telling the story through page after page after page of narrative, that doesn't bring the story to life for me. We've spoken in previous episodes about plot, character, theme, and the relationship between those three. For me, character is always the most interesting of the three. For some people, it's plot. For some people, they want to see a theme. They want a commentary on issues. But for me, it's characters, it's people. And the only way you're really going to get to know those characters is in their words and their actions, and dialogue is the words. So it needs to be done well, and it needs to be in there. It's a major part of it.
It wouldn't be a podcast episode if I didn't make a video game reference. So I'm going to say, I think some of the best dialogue I have seen is in, I'm going to say, two games. I'm going to say Dragon Age Origins and Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate, and they are very, 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 very much one in the same game. As far as 5 stars, cannot rate enough good about them. I'm a Final Fantasy stan, first and foremost, but Dragon Age and Baldur's Gate, Dragon Age Origins, I have to make that clear, and Baldur's Gate 3 are hands down in my top 10 favorite games. And one of the coolest things that they do in those games that I think really brings the world to life and really lets you get to know your characters is the dialogue that happens when you're just walking around and not doing anything, or when there's something of importance. Your characters in the background will have a conversation. You can see the floating text bubble of what they're saying, but they will literally talk to each other about what's going on. And I think that is hands down my favorite thing from any RPG, because I can get to know the characters, I can interact with the characters. but you never know how the characters interact with each other. Let's go more modern reference, and let's say more mainstream reference. Let's say Final Fantasy VII. You see, to a lesser degree, how the characters interact with each other, but mostly they're interacting with Cloud. But you don't necessarily... And let's go even back a little bit. Let's go to the original PlayStation 1 versus the remake. You don't really see how the party members interact with each other. You get a sort of basic glance with characters like Barrett and Tifa who have backstories together. But, I mean, it really wasn't until the remake that you got to see the comparison with Aerith and Tifa getting to interact with each other. And that's something that I think a lot of games are starting to pick up on, but it still don't do a fantastic job of doing, is dialogue interaction with the characters. Because it's, you are the main character of your group, whether you're Cloud, whether you're Byleth from Fire Emblem Three Houses, whether you're Squall from Final Fantasy VIII, you're the main character, and you are leading this group of ragtag characters, and you know how you feel about them, and you know how they feel about you, but you never really, until you go looking for it, you don't really get to know how they feel about each other. It's in these games like Fire Emblem, where the characters that you have with you have support conversations with each other, or Dragon Age and Baldur's Gate, where the characters talk to each other in the background. That adds such another level of detail that I can't begin to explain how much more entranced into the world I get when I can hear how other characters react to other characters. I find that such a cool thing, and that really helps me to decide, do I like this character or do I not?
Yeah, we've spoken about Dragon Age Origins quite a lot, and that the way it's done was a masterclass for me. That's when it's transcended from here's a game to here's a story. It's an interactive story, and not in a click this way to go one, this way to go another. It's something you're fully immersed with. So I certainly took a lot away from storytelling from that. I thought it was fantastically done. And Final Fantasy VII, wow. If you haven't played it, go play it. It's awesome.
Yeah, even if you've never played the original, play Remake, because Remake as a whole, another game in itself. As of recording this, Rebirth just got a new... Rebirth got their official launch trailer a few days ago, and I cannot tell you how excited that made me. I can't wait for February. Besides my older son's birthday, I can't wait to get my hands on that game.
Yeah, it's been too long between them. The first one, I was probably the same as everyone else in an era of remakes and sequels. I was like, oh, don't touch Final Fantasy VII. But I'll get off the fence. I think it's better than the original. Like Top Gun 2, it's better than the original. When these things are done well, they're done really well.
Hands down, I agree. Well, now that we've gone full circle and we've talked about dialogue, narration, and of course I threw in a video game reference, is there anything else you want to throw out to the show, Mark?
Gosh, no. Well, sorry, that's more editing out, isn't it? I can't think of anything. I was going to make a slight reference almost to when we said video games, that I actually spent money on Lawnmower Simulator on the PS5, thinking it would be a comedy game, thinking it was going to be something funny. It's not. It's serious. It's exactly what it says. And I mean, it's impressive the way it's done, but I still want my money back. I thought it was a joke. That's all. That's all I got.
See, where you went wrong is you should have gotten Power Washer Simulator, which is actually made by Square Enix, so you could have gotten the Final Fantasy VII pack.
Oh, I didn't realize that was a thing. Right, well, okay, that's my evening sorted.
All right, guys, let us know what you think. As always, we'd love to hear your feedback. Let us know how you feel about dialogue. We'd love to engage in a dialogue with our fans, so let us know what books you really like that we've put out that do dialogue well. Let us know which books you think that we could have had, we could have improved the dialogue on. We always love to hear your feedback. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Brandon.
I'm Mark.
And we'll catch you guys in the next episode.